Hi everyone, welcome to part one on our lecture on this module, which is on the industrial foundations of California. In this module, in this first part, in part one, we're gonna talk about the progressive era, excuse me. We're gonna talk about Hollywood and whiteness in part two, and then the migrant experience in California in part three. And so the progressive era lasted from the 1890s to the 1920s and into World War II, depending on who you ask. And progressives at that time were concerned with solving the problems created by industrialization and urbanization. Um, and this also saw the good governments movement. So this idea that government should be serving the people, which seems like a pretty rational idea, but governments, as you know, are often accused of serving the wealthy and the elite. So there were a lot of people of this time who wanted government to serve the masses, serve the most people, do the most good for the most. And so there were a couple of things that they were about. Protecting social welfare was one of them, and workers' rights. This is not in California, but at this time we saw books like The Jungle, published by Upton Sinclair, which is quite a famous novel. I recommend reading it if you haven't, about workers' conditions in Chicago at the time. They were also concerned with living conditions, especially in urban areas. And we saw the rise of a lot of unions at this time to protect those workers' rights and give them suitable working conditions and wages. We also saw a concern with morality. A lot of this was race-based, people concerned that this kind of influx of immigrants was somehow affecting the morality of the country. A lot of the focus was on personal behavior, right? So being a moral and just person yourself, not necessarily about society's effect on you. This is also the time when we saw prohibition, which for a while, alcohol was illegal in the United States. That failed. When we had prohibition, we actually just had this incredible underground of alcohol production. This is a poster for that time about voting for prohibition. Seen as if you vote against prohibition, it's basically for this kind of gluttonous businessman who's making money, or if you vote for prohibition, it's for the sake of the family. We also saw the rise of women's clubs. You read in your chapter, hopefully, about Carolyn Severance, who's pictured here. And so these women fought for social causes, such as women's suffrage and kindergarten, which I'll talk about in a second. But many of these women's clubs excluded minorities, right? So very much still a function of white women in upper society. And while these women were very socially active, they did it in the capacity of themselves as mothers and caretakers, right? They really saw themselves as it was their duty as women to take care of society and have a morally just society. So Carolyn Severance formed the Friday Morning Club, which was quite a famous one in Los Angeles. That again focused on things such as women's suffrage, which is women gaining the right to vote, which they eventually did, but for quite some time women were not allowed to vote in this country. And also kindergarten came out of this movement. So this idea of education for small children and universal education for small children, regardless of class or social status. We also had a couple of things going on during this era in regards to the environment. So we had kind of two main groups of people who were concerned about the environment and had different stances on it. And again, we have this rise of kind of industrialization and urbanization, and people are seeing the widespread effects of this and kind of the harsh effects on the environment, and they are being concerned about it. So for the preservation ethic, you had people like John Muir here, who's on the right, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, um, kind of sought to protect Yosemite National Park. Here he is with Roosevelt. And so preservationists believe that nature deserves protection for its own inherent value, not just for use, and also should not be touched by humans. So John Muir, who is uh, a very well-regarded figure, especially for his preservation of Yosemite, very much believed that people should just not be in these landscapes, and that includes Native Americans. So a lot of Native Americans were forced off of these lands when they were protected. But we should protect our environment in its pristine, unaltered state. And that's how we wound up with our national park system. National parks in the beginning were very, very different. They actually catered to the wealthy. Yosemite National Park, when it was first established and kind of remade, had wealthy hotels and tennis courts and pools, which is a far cry from what its goal is now. And then you also had people who had more of this conservation ethic. This is Gifford Pinchot, who you don't have to know about, but he was a big figure at the time. And they also believed in protecting natural resources, but basically it was to use natural resources wisely, right? So as opposed to them being protected just for their own sake, basically protecting them for human use. So it's a utilitarian standard that calls for using resources for the greatest good for the most people for the longest time. And this really aligns with that progressive era because we want our natural resources to be here for us and to serve the most people. And tied into this, which you read about, was the circumstance of the water supply in cities, especially in places like San Francisco. So the growing city of San Francisco needed a stable water supply. And this was especially shown after the 1906 earthquake and subsequent fire that burned down the city. One of the reasons the fire was so bad was because there wasn't a constant, steady water supply in order to put that fire out. And so that kind of brought this to national attention. And water at the time was a private entity, not a public utility. And so, which is a pretty foreign concept to us in this country, right? Water is a public utility. We have full access to cheap water. Not that we haven't had problems with our water, but generally speaking, on any given day, you're going to turn on your tap and water's going to come out, and it's going to be clean, and you're not going to have to worry about it. And San Francisco had a couple of problems with its water supply. It couldn't really draw on local water. Local water was salty. Being so close to the ocean, they had problems with saltwater intrusion, so their local water was very salty. And also, San Francisco is a pretty arid environment, so you're not getting a ton of precipitation in order to draw from for that city. So you have this massive city that's growing, a city that was recently destroyed by fire, and we really need to have a water source that is reliable and clean for its residents. But this idea of water being a public utility came out of the progressive era, so it wasn't a given at the time. And so the answer to this was the creation of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is actually in Yosemite National Park and serves, still today, serves San Francisco via the Hetch Hetchy Aqueduct. So it dammed the Tuolumne River and provided this gravity-fed natural system for water for the city, and you're going to watch another short video about that. But basically, you had this Hetch Hetchy Valley, which was this beautiful valley, very much like Yosemite Valley, that was dammed and flooded. Many people thought this, including John Muir and the Sierra Club, which he founded, spent a lot of time in courts trying to prevent this, again, that preservation ethic of we need to just preserve the valley the way that it is versus this conservation ethic that we need to use this valuable resource for San Francisco and for the most number of people. And so you're going to watch a video about Hetch Hetchy. There have been a lot of problems with California's water supply throughout the years. Generally speaking, we do not have enough water here in California in the places that we need it, including places like San Diego. So we take water from other places. And so how do we sustain all of these people who live here now? And so that is the end of part 1. You're now going to watch a video again about Hetch Hetchy, and then you're going to move on to part 2 of lecture.